Thank you, and hello, Nordic.js. So yes, I've kind of been doing stuff on the web since 1996. That makes me quite old. And it means that I've kind of seen how things have changed over the years. I think most importantly, out of all that stuff, I'm a member of the CSS working group. So I'm now one of the people who kind of trying to find what CSS actually is. But as mentioned, I've been teaching CSS for about 20 years, and I've written a lot of books and articles. One of those books was titled, not by me it has to be said, as Everything You Know About CSS is Wrong. It was an utterly ridiculous title. I was quite cross about it. But maybe today I'd actually be justified in using it. Because I've taught CSS, and CSS for layout in particular, in pretty much the same way that everybody else has. This is a block thing, this is an inline thing. You can change the things between block and inline. Hey, here's the box model. It's very, very important and also very weird. And then we do this stuff with widths and floats and try to make a layout. But as I've been teaching this stuff to people, and I've been reordering my material and kind of working out what's the best way to teach layout, it's become apparent to me that the way we've been teaching CSS layout isn't giving new folk the skills that they need to actually learn the new things that are coming along. And more than that, I think that our sort of continued talking about CSS as this weird and hacky language encourages people to not take it seriously. In fact, it encourages people to do all they can to not use features of the language. You see, other languages, when we approach them with beginners, we start with the important constructs of that language. You know, if you're not a programmer and you want to learn JavaScript or PHP or anything else, you're going to be taught variables, basic math, you're going to be taught string handling, conditional logic, before you start hacking on a website. CSS, we jump right in and just start kind of pushing things around without really any knowledge about what we're doing. It doesn't give people a good footing. And it's no wonder that people then become reliant on kind of, Stack Overflow-driven development, just copying and pasting stuff and crossing their fingers and hoping that it will work. So in this talk, I'm going to describe CSS layout as a system, in the way that I believe we need to be setting out our stall when we talk about and teach CSS. And this is kind of my attempt to create that footing for layout. You'll notice I've not listed here grid or flexbox in particular, because I think that adds to this strange idea that these things are anything other than a value of display. Instead, we need to teach these fundamentals. And you'll see as we go along, you'll see plenty of grid and flexbox along the way. But once you understand the parts of this system that ties everything together, the rest really is just learning syntax. So display. CSS has a system for layout. It's how we lay out web pages and web applications, and the main layout methods all belong to the display property. If you want to do layout, you need to change the value of display. And you see, we're always returning in CSS to normal flow, to block and inline layout, and we need to understand that this is the default state of layout, the state to which we will return if we do nothing else. Items are participating in a block formatting context. We sometimes talk about this as being no layout, but this is layout. It's block and inline layout. Each thing is a block thing or an inline thing. And if you write some HTML, do nothing else, your HTML document is going to be laid out like this. The block things doing what block things do, the inline things doing what inline things do. And that's really important. We don't need to define the way every single HTML element looks. We don't have to stop things overlapping. CSS does this for us. And the more we work with this rather than against it, the easier our job is. If we strip everything away with a heavy-handed reset style sheet, we're then left with putting all this stuff back. That's actually doing a bunch of work that we've already done. So once you understand that you've got layout, that our items are participating in a block formatting context, you better understand what it is to change the value of display, because then we're just creating a different kind of layout. So here I've got a block layout. Items are displaying one after the other as block items. If I change the value of display to flex, the items now display alongside each other. They're flex items. They're no longer participating in a block formatting context. They're participating in a flex formatting context. And that comes along with a bunch of initial values of the various flex properties. Or if I change the value to grid, The items are now participating in a grid formatting context. By default, that will give me a single column grid with implicit rows. I need to add some other grid properties in order to make something that looks a bit like a grid. So I'm using grid template columns here to create some column tracks. Whether we grid or we flex, we only change the value of display on that element. Only the direct children then participate in the flex or grid formatting context. Their children go right back to block flow layout. So you can see that here I've added some more content to one of the grid items, a header and 2 paragraphs, and they're just displaying in normal flow. And so it goes on all the way down through the structure of your site. You either stay with the block formatting context, or you switch to another formatting context. Inside that, you're going to return to normal flow, and then you can make the decision again, one box at a time, all the way down. And once we're thinking like this, that kind of question of should I use grid or flexbox or something else, it doesn't really matter. We just pick the value of display that makes the most sense for that layer of things. But it's here in display that we see the refactoring of CSS writ large. The display specification now details 2 values for display, not 1. These values describe the outer and the inner display types. The outer display type is always block or inline, and that talks about how the box behaves alongside all of the other boxes in the display, in the layout. The inner display type is the kind the children use. That might be flex items or grid items or what have you. So when we say display grid, in the new syntax, we're saying display block grid. The outer of this element is block, the children are grid items. If we said display flex, we're saying we've got an outer block and inner flex children. Those values of inline-grid and inline-flex, which talk about inline, flex, and grid items, they're going to be refactored to display inline grid and display inline flex. So Firefox 70, the next version of Firefox, has actually implemented these new 2-value versions, but I don't expect anyone to race out and use them because, of course, there's not the browser support yet. The reason they matter, though, is they explain properly how display works. You're setting the outer display type, block or inline, and then you're setting the inner display type, and that might be flow layout or grid or flex or something yet that we haven't defined. And if we just think about that normal flow for a moment, our page establishes what we call an initial block formatting context. And a block formatting context, or BFC, has some features. So for instance, floats can't poke out at the bottom of a block formatting context. Margins don't collapse through it. And this is what happens when you don't have a block formatting context on a container. You float a thing, the line boxes are shortened to make way for the floated thing, but otherwise it's taken out of flow, which is why it escapes the block level container that is around it. And we've got this newish value of flow root in the 2-value world, that would be block flow root, and that causes the containing block to wrap the image and the text. And that does it by creating a new block formatting context. So just like the page, it's like a mini layout inside your layout that contains everything inside it. It's exactly what you've done if you've ever used overflow. If you've changed the value of overflow to auto or something to contain floats, what you're doing there is creating a new BFC because you can't have a scrolling thing that things kind of poke out of. So we need to make a new BFC in order to allow you to have that scrolling thing. You've got a new block formatting context. Flow root lets you do that without any of the sort of added baggage of changing something that might cause scroll bars. And then we have writing modes. So when Flexbox and Grid lands in our browsers, they also kind of quietly introduced this writing mode agnostic way of working with layout, because everything that came before kind of talked about the physical dimensions of the screen, top, right, bottom, and left, width, and height. And these concepts in writing mode are really important to our understanding of layout today. So the block dimension is the direction in which blocks are displayed on the page. In English, which is written horizontally, blocks are displayed vertically, one below the other down the page. The inline dimension is the direction words run in a sentence. So in English, that's left to right horizontally. If we use a vertical writing mode, the block dimension is now running horizontally and the inline vertically. So if you want to think about start in the block dimension or line 1 in grid, then that's the line at which the blocks start. In English, that's the top of the element. In a vertical RL language, on the right. So that's block start. Where the blocks end, that's block end. If you need to think about start in the inline direction or line 1 in grid, that's where a sentence begins in that writing mode and direction. On the left for English, on the right for Arabic, at the top for a vertical writing mode. That's inline start. The other end, that's inline end. And so here we find a tension between the fact that our new layout methods only refer to block and inline start and end, and everything else on the web is tied to physical dimensions of the screen, to top right, bottom left. If you try and build something using vertical writing mode, then you soon find this out. We should be able to build a grid layout, for example, flip it on its side with writing mode vertical RL, and it all stay the same, but it doesn't quite work, because width and height and padding and margins, they're all related to the screen and not the flow of the content. So to solve this, we've got a whole new CSS specification. It's logical properties and values. It's basically just a set of mappings, mapping the physical world to the logical flow relative one. If we take that grid example, the first thing we need to do is change the width and height to the flow relative inline size and block size. And that means we can then turn the thing over and everything stays the same. It stays the same shape, the same dimensions. And because we've already looked at block and inline, hopefully the names make a bit of sense. The block size property defines the size in the block dimension, which in a horizontal writing mode is height. The inline size property is the size in the inline dimension, which in a horizontal writing mode is width. Turn the grid on its side using writing mode, the block and inline dimensions change, and therefore inline size maps to height and block size to width. And then we've got mappings for everything else, for margins, for padding, and for border. And my favorites are the mappings for border radius, because the naming gets really fun. So if you look at the longhands here for the individual corners, border top left radius in a horizontal writing mode, the left to right direction becomes border start radius, because it's the start of the inline and the start of the block dimension. And you'll be glad that you don't often specify these corners individually. Now again, as with things that I've talked about before, browsers have implemented these mappings already, so you could start using them. You probably won't unless you're working in something that does a lot with different writing modes, because obviously older browsers aren't going to support them. They're going to support the physical properties. But the important thing about this stuff is to understand that we are moving to this flow relative logical world. And grid and flexbox make a lot more sense when seen through a lens of writing modes. Once you start to think about the block and inline dimensions, once you start to think about start and end, those layout methods make an awful lot more sense. And a key place you'll see this is in alignment. Alignment's a really key spec, which a lot of other specs use. If you learned Flexbox first, you might think of some of these properties as Flexbox properties. They were initially there, but they've all been moved into the box alignment spec. And so alignment is defined for all of the layout methods, for Flex and for Grid, and for block and inline layout too, although we don't have any browser implementations for block layout. And the idea is that it means that basically we can use these alignment methods, and it doesn't matter which layout method we're using. They're all going to work the same. And the reason that we need to talk about writing modes first before we can talk about alignment is that alignment is specified using those dimensions. So when we talk about alignment, we talk about two things. We need to talk about the distribution of space between the items in a particular formatting context, and we need to talk about the alignment of the items within their area in that layout. So the first, the distribution of space around items, I think is most easily understood in grid layout, and I always teach alignment first in grid rather than Flexbox. If I've got a grid with fixed-size tracks that aren't large enough to fill the grid area, I've got some extra space, basically, in my grid. And here I've got some extra space in both dimensions, block and inline. Now, by default, the tracks will be aligned to start in both dimensions. That's their initial values. If I want to space things out in the inline dimension, I use justify content. We use justify because if you think about when you justify the words in a line, that happens in the inline dimension. If I wanted to space things out in the block dimension, I would use align content. But let's look at justify first. So here I'm distributing the space. I'm saying, and I'm using here the Firefox Grid Inspector, if you can see the little sort of highlighting of the grid tracks. If you're working with CSS layout, you really want to use Firefox. The grid and flex tools are really, really amazing and make this all a lot easier to see. So this is justify content. We're doing space between. And then align content works in exactly the same way, but on the block axis. And so here I've aligned the tracks to the end. So basically the spare space gets picked up and put before the tracks. Now Flexbox is a bit different because we have one main axis and we can change it between row and column. So in Flexbox, we think about the main and the cross axis rather than block and inline. And the justify content property works on the main axis, which initially will be row. So if we say justify content in Flexbox, that's main axis space distribution. So I've got justify content flex end, and the items all move to the end, and the space is put before them. You can use align content in Flexbox as long as you've got space on the cross axis. So here I've got some wrapped flex items. I've got some extra space. I can say align content space around, and the items space out just as they would on the main axis. And it's worth remembering because I often get asked, why aren't these properties working? You need to have extra space in the axis that you're aligning or justifying on in order to distribute that space for them to do anything. If you've got tightly packed flex or items or grid tracks, there's no spare space, these properties will do absolutely nothing at all. You've then got alignment of things inside an area. Again, I think this is easier to work on in grid because you've always got both dimensions. So here I've got grid items. Some of them are stretched over a few tracks. And the properties we want to use here are justify self and align self. Now, the default value for those properties is stretch, which is why we get kind of full height columns by default. The only time we don't stretch by default is if your item, your direct child of the grid container or flex container, has an intrinsic aspect ratio. That's something like an image, because typically you don't want your images stretched out of proportion, sort of by default. So if it's got an aspect ratio, we align to start. Otherwise, we use stretch. To align on the inline axis, we use the property which starts with justify. So justify self end here is bumping the item over to the end. To align on the block axis, we use the property which begins align. Align self end aligns the item to the end on the block dimension. And if you want to set all of the properties at once, we can use justify items and align items, which then is moving them all to the end. Now, if we switch into Flexbox, we don't have a concept of justify self on the main axis. The reason being there's no area like there is in grid. Flex items work as a group on the main axis. You can basically just sort of push them around, or you can distribute space inside the items to kind of get them to absorb the extra space. But you don't align individual items. So that's important to know. We've got these alignment properties in the box alignment spec, but they do not apply equally to all layout methods because not all layout methods kind of make sense with them all. So you kind of have to look at all the properties and then see which layout methods they're going to apply to. So in Flexbox, we can obviously align individual items on the cross axis. So we're sort of there, we're sort of moving the item up and down when I've got the items as a row using align self. But you might need some kind of self-alignment of individual items in Flexbox. Sometimes you want to kind of split the group. You've got a navigation where you want half the items to be over one side and half to be over the other. And if you want to do that, you can use auto margins. Because auto margins absorb any available space in the dimension you apply them to. Now, you know this. If you've ever centered a block on the page and you've set margin left and margin right to auto, it pushes the block into the middle because you've got two margins that are trying to grab all of the extra space. So you can do this to sort of cause a split in your flex items if you want to. That's as described in the spec. That's how you're sort of supposed to do this stuff, which kind of leads me to another point. Let's stop talking about stuff in CSS and calling it a trick or a hack when it is exactly what is said in the spec. You know, things like this auto margin stuff, that's exactly as specified to do that job. And then right at the top of the talk, I mentioned the box model, and so far I've not talked about it at all. And it's not because I don't think it's important anymore, I just think it's far less important than it used to be. And I must have explained the box model more times to more people than pretty much anyone at this point. So it was really important. Because the only way we could make something look like a grid when all we had was floats was to give everything a size and percentages and make sure that across the whole boxes we didn't get more than 100%, because if we got more than 100%, bad things were going to happen. So we had to understand the box model to stop that happening. And until very recent memory, the width we gave our items wasn't even the width that they took up on the page. And it's no wonder that this is really confusing, and we had to sort of really dig into the box model and explain it to people. But this is really all I think we need to know about the box model today. This is going to be my sort of box model version with added dev tools. So everything in CSS is a box. The block level box is a very specific thing. It's got some default behavior. It expands to fill the inline dimension, and it grows in the block dimension only to the size of the content. We can, however, give it a width and a height. When we do, CSS has to decide what that size means, and it has to take into account the various things that make up a box. A box has the content, and we refer to this as the content box. You might then give it some padding. If you do, this is added around the content. The edge of this is referred to as the padding box. The box might have a visible border. If you do, then the size of this border is added to the outside of the padding, and that's the border box. The box then might have a margin, and this is then added to the outside of the border. It's an invisible area. It pushes things away that are outside the box, and this then defines the margin box. If your box has a width or a height or an inline or block size in this new world, what's that size? By default, that is the size of the content box. That means if you give the box a width, the visible space it takes up is the width you've given it plus the padding and the border, because it's using the content box. If you want to use another box, then you can use a specific keyword for that box. Now, pretty much the entire web at this point has agreed that border box is the best way to size boxes, because that means the width you define is the width of the visible box on the page. And that pretty much is what you need to know about the box model. We've got keywords that allow us to toggle what the inline and block size actually means. We don't need to go into the history of it. This is just what it is, and here's how to change it. Then we can move on to far more interesting things about sizing. Because how is sizing worked out across different layout models? You know, having to specify everything in lengths and percentages and ensuring they all add up is the way of the past, because our new layout methods do an awful lot of this work for us. And to understand how, we really need to know a couple of concepts. What is the minimum size of this thing, and what is the maximum size of this thing? We've actually got some keywords that let us define that. So if I take a 2-column grid with 2 grid items, and the 2 items contain the same text there, the first column is set to min content, the second to max content. You can see how the first column has become as small as it possibly can be. It's sort of all wrapping everything around. Every sort of soft breaking opportunity is taken. That's the min content size of that item. The second column has gone to max content size, which means it doesn't wrap at all. The string just unwraps and unwraps. It was a really long string. It would just keep going and cause an overflow. So that's the max content size, as big as it needs to be for the content, but no bigger. Now, when we work out sizing in CSS, we do that based on these sizes, which means it's vital when we're talking about CSS, we talk about them, because any content-based space distribution starts with them. So if you think for a minute about Flexbox, if you've got 3 items of different sizes, use the flex initial values, they don't grow to fill the space. There's enough room for them here, so they've all gone to max content size. You can see that they've got as big as they can be, and then they've stopped growing. Now, if I give them flex auto, that's like I'd set flex 1 auto, so they're allowed to grow and shrink from auto. Now, it kind of looks there like we've got 3 equally sized items. But that's only because we've got around the same amount of content. If we add more content to one item, you can see the item with a bigger item has got more space. It's become bigger, and the other items have actually shrunk down to min content size. They won't go smaller than that, but that's how they've gone down and how they're being displayed. So if you do want 3 equal items, you need to set the flex spaces to 0, because there we're saying these boxes have got no size at all, distribute all of the space equally. This is how the browser's working this stuff out. If you sort of figure this out, you can then think like a browser. It'll make your life an awful lot easier. And speaking about browsers, I've not talked a lot about browser support, because, in fact, everything I've spoken about is available in at least one browser, but some of it isn't available in all of them. But I think we need to talk about CSS the way it's designed versus the fact that it's not fully implemented everywhere. We've got a system that's been designed, and then we have software that implements this system. And just like you might write a specification for a piece of software, you might release it without everything being there because you realize it's useful without some of those things. And so this is a comprehensible state of affairs. So in addition to us being complicit in talking about CSS as if it were this flaky, badly behaved, randomly designed thing, we've also talked about browsers being part of the problem for long past the point at which they were. You know, lack of support is very different to the buggy support of the past. Sometimes one engine lags behind one feature or another. Yes, there are sometimes bugs. Who knew software has bugs? Sometimes a browser has implemented a spec prior to some major change. But none of this is due to browsers actively working against our interests. And we've got the tools to actually deal with that. Things like feature queries to detect whether a browser supports something or not and then act accordingly. So CSS has grown up. We need to stop talking about it as this weird and quirky thing. Over the last few years, CSS has changed, creating a cohesive and sensible layout system out of a language that's like no other. Because it serves an environment, in fact, multiple environments that are like no other. This means that we can teach it in a robust and structured manner, giving people the skills to use the CSS of today and to be able to cope with the CSS of the past. Teach the CSS of today. Don't burden beginners with our histories. Let's keep the scars of the browser wars for our own reminiscing and keep moving forward, refactoring the way we talk about CSS. Thank you.